Today, my guest and I discuss playing Dungeons & Dragons with children.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Now, it is my mission to help game masters cut down their prep time and have more fun at the table. Also, for players to understand how they can add to the gaming experience in their own way. I do that by taking a look at tabletop RPGs from a variety of different topics. That's why I interview artists, novelists, archaeologists, in addition to game designers. If you want to learn more about me, you can head over to dicegeeks.com. I have tons of free resources as well as RPG books that you can explore that will help you cut down your Game Master prep time and help you have more fun at the gaming table. Enough of all that. Here's the interview. My guest today is the host of the Raised on D&D podcast, Nicholas Cardarelli. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
No problem. When did you first play Dungeons & Dragons?
Well, actually, I started when I was 12 years old. I had friends who belonged to an elite program in middle school called Alpha, and their teacher let them play Dungeons & Dragons after they had completed their schoolwork. Well, they enjoyed it so much at school, they brought it home to the neighborhood, and we started playing. We started with Palladium books, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then tried MERPs, which is Middle Earth Role Playing, which was it was very difficult for 12-year-olds who had no real gaming experience to kind of tackle. But eventually, my older brother, his best friend at the time was a dungeon master of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and he ran a game for me and my friends, and that kind of sparked the love of tabletop role-playing games.
Okay. Why do you think you were drawn to it so much?
Well, I really had been raised on classic science fiction and fantasy. So I had already read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I was fortunate enough to grow up in the 80s, and we were exposed to sword and sorcery movies from Conan the Barbarian, to Deathstalker, to Beastmaster, all of those things. Of course, He-Man was real big at that time. So all of those things, the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon still came on Saturday mornings. So all of those things kind of paved the road for tabletop role-playing games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess I had a similar experience then because I was enjoying all of those same things, I think. Yeah. And now, did you play for a long time, or did you start running games?
So I played for a long time. We started playing with school friends, and our group grew and grew. And in fact, at one point, there were maybe 12 people around the table. And our game master at the time was very good, not only in understanding the rules, but the pace of the story. He was wonderful at being impartial. So I just kind of watched him and learned from him. And then as high school came, I started to attempt to run games on my own. And what ended up happening was I ended up going into games that he didn't run. Vampire the Masquerade became one of the games that I became a storyteller in. Palladium Fantasy was our game of choice. So those kind of things helped me to kind of not only have this mentor dungeon master who really showed me how to do it, but also then I got to try out different game systems and kind of spread my wings, as it were.
Well, it sounds like you have played quite a number of different systems then.
Well, I have, and that's really more thanks to a role-playing game club that I started in my early 20s. So I had moved out of home. My friends had all gone off to either military service or to college. I had this great corporate job, and I was in my first apartment. So I was trying to get people together to game with. And I went to the local comic book store, and they had this sad little corkboard. It wasn't even hanged on the wall. It was just like rested up against a pillar in the store. And it had all these like sticky notes and like ripped corners of pieces of paper. And it said, interested in playing D&D, call Dave at 555-1234, right? And I looked at it and I was like, oh, I can do way better than this. I went home, I got on the computer, I found some clip art, and I made this nice little page-sized poster that said, interested in playing Dungeons and Dragons, contact Nick, so on and so forth, right? But it looked nice, it looked professional, okay? And I took it back. Well, I thought that all the little giblets of paper on this corkboard they were distracting from my advertisement. So I took them all down. And as I'm in the midst of taking them all down, the clerk at the game store comes up behind me and he says very sternly, "Can I help you?" And I turn around and I go, "Yes. Where do you keep the record of how long these ads for games have been on your bulletin board?" And he goes, we don't. And I was like, okay, well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take them and I'd like to call all the people that are looking for games, because see, I'm starting a role-playing game club for the entire city. Do we already have one, or is there a need for it? And he goes, "Oh, well, there was one, but it didn't last very long." I said, "Well, mine is going to last very long. I've got it all planned out, and I can't wait to start it." And he got very excited, and he says, the store would be a sponsor and would back us and help get the word out and all these things. And I walked out very proud of myself that I got out of that awkward situation without a confrontation, with not really having any plan of starting a gaming club for the city. Well, as months went by, the clerk didn't let me forget about our interaction. Every time I came into the comic book store, it was, "How is this gaming club going? Has it started yet? What are your plans?" And through our interactions, a plan was formed. And people started responding to my little ad, and I got some players for my table, and I became close friends with them. And I said, "Hey, this guy at the game store, he just won't let it go. I'm thinking about actually starting the club. Do you think I could do it? Would you guys help me?" That organization celebrated 19 years of continual service to our community this year. And I was the president for 6 years, and then I retired. and my predecessor has been keeping it going all these years. So it's very impressive. We average 35 to 45 members per year, and as all gamers know, gamers are kind of can be transient. They come and go, they move, they find jobs that conflict with schedules, things like that. It's the same problem with any private table, but on a larger scale. But we average 35 to 45 members a year. And during those 6 years, we offered all kinds of programs. We didn't want to leave anybody out. So we weren't just a D&D club. We were a tabletop role-playing club. And so because of that, we wanted not only to offer different games for people, but we wanted to expose our members to as many different tabletop games as we could. And that, in turn, led me to trying out games that I probably never would have. I got to try out games like Shadowrun and Call of Cthulhu, and I got to revisit the World of Darkness. At the time period that this happened was in 2001, so third edition D&D had come out. It had just gotten big, and it brought a lot of the older gamers back to the hobby and brand new players in. So I attribute the Lakeland Role Playing Guild for my exposure to so many different games.
Well, I mean, that's an incredible story. And it is something else that you are able to keep, a club together that long, like you were saying. It is sometimes hard to keep 4 or 5 people together, let alone, 30 to 40, people over 19 years.
It was quite a feat, as any game master will tell you. Organizing gamers is like herding cats, and like you said, 4 to 6 cats are hard enough. Never mind 35 to 45. But I enjoyed it. I loved it. But my schedule just couldn't allow me to continue because my first child was born, and so as demands of fatherhood started to press in on my time, I understood that the club would suffer if I didn't back away. And so I did. And my predecessor took over where I left off. He had his own style, and he had his own techniques. And he did an amazing job. So I'm very proud of that organization and of him and of all the friends that, of course, with any gaming table, you sometimes lasts a lifetime. And many of those old friends, even 19 years later, we're still in touch. We still game every once in a while.
Yeah, that's awesome. But now your love of role playing has kind of spilled over into a podcast. Why don't you tell us a little about your podcast?
Well, thank you. Raised on D&D podcast. I was not expecting to create a podcast. I wasn't. It was never a plan of mine. What had happened was, because of not only just because of the lockdown, but also because a lot of my friends and family are all over the country, and I have a lot of international friends. I like to talk, for the last 10 years, I talked about gaming with my children on social media and just kind of sharing, what we did together online, like families do. And I bought myself a microphone to run Roll20 games for family and friends out of state or out of town. And my brother is a internet disc jockey. He has his own show. And I said to him, hey, I got this microphone, And it worked really well for the online game. What else could I do with it? And we started talking, and he brought up the fact that maybe I should try podcasting. Well, I talked to my wife about it, and I said, I really want to talk about something that I'm passionate about, but I don't want to do a controversial show. And she said, well, you love gaming, and you love gaming with the kids, so why don't you do a show about those topics, about parenting, family, and gaming? And I said, okay. And I came up with the title Raised on D&D, not because I was raised on D&D, but because my children were. And a lot of people are surprised by this, but I had them around the gaming table even as infants, but started gaming with them very young. When my children are all real close together. Right now they're 14, 13, and soon to be 12. They're little stair steps, 17 months apart. And so when the oldest was 4, the middle was 3, this was almost 2. We kind of started, you don't just jump to Dungeons and Dragons with preschoolers. It begins way earlier. It really started for my children at bedtime stories. Well, the bedtime stories evolved from just being told a story to being interactive, getting their input. What do you think should happen next? Then they wanted cameos of their favorite franchise characters, and they wanted crossovers. So I'd be telling bedtime stories of the Scooby-Doo gang with the bridge crew of the Star Trek Enterprise, and a zany adventure that involved all of them. Well, then the children wanted to be in the story, so now they could directly interact with the characters and with the plot. And that led us to finally getting to the table and rolling dice. And so it evolved from there. But for the last 10 years, I had been sharing those family moments online. So I realized they had literally been raised on D&D. And even now, with the holiday weekend coming up, we're going to be playing their first game of Call of Cthulhu as our holiday horror adventure.
That sounds incredible. Why was it so important to you to introduce your kids at such a young age to tabletop role-playing games?
Well, children benefit from tabletop role-playing games in many ways. I mean, it not only do they learn skills like teamwork and patience and strategy and things like that, it also sparks curiosity and interest in many different topics, from literature to history. Depending on the genre, you could even develop a interest in technology or mythology, things like that. But the reason it was so important to me was that nothing beats the camaraderie that's made around the game table between players and dungeon masters. I have friends from 30 years ago that I gamed with, and maybe we've only spoken from time to time over the decades, but sit us in a room and we start talking about those old adventures, and it's a bond that lasts. So introducing my children to tabletop role-playing games in the beginning, it was a way to keep them entertained for quite some time. and it was something that I knew how to do. But as the years went on, it became something that strengthened that family bond and the camaraderie that I share with dozens of people over the decades. I now share with my children, and that was very important to me.
Yeah, and of course, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've had similar experiences like that too. Yes, that I haven't seen an old friend maybe for 20, 25 years, 30 years. But if I say a certain series of words about a certain adventure that we were on when we were 9 or 10, we're kind of connected just again.
Yep, right back there where you were, and that's a very powerful experience to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now, I'm just kind of thinking, if you're running games, once you kind of moved out of the storytelling kind of phase, if somebody's out there, wanting to run games with their kids, what are some keys that they should keep in mind when they're going to run a session for, maybe like a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old or something like that?
Sure. Well, one of the things about my podcast, Raised on D&D, is I actually interview not only parents, but also people who work with youth, and they have all kinds of advice and experience with gaming with children. And to be honest, I've learned a lot through the interviews that I've conducted on the podcast, from people with as much or even more experience than I have, and especially with dealing with not just their children, but other people's children. But one of the things that I keep getting as a consistent answer is to start small. Shorter sessions, maybe even a single encounter. This all depends, of course, on the age bracket that you're working with. Now, when my children started playing tabletop role-playing games, really just had to do like a rules light version of Dungeons and Dragons. But now there are so many options, so many wonderful games out there. No Thank You Evil is written by Monty Cook. There's Hero Kids RPG by Justin Holiday. Amazing Tales by Martin Lloyd. Playground Adventures by BJ Hensley. These games are actually geared towards younger players. So if you have preschoolers or young elementary children, you can actually find a game that's already geared towards that age group with rules that are easy for them to follow, and the adventures are compact, shorter, little bite-size versions for younger players. I say start off small, but parents of young gamers, they know how much attention span they have, right? How much seat time they can handle. And the other thing is if the children are excited, if you plan on, a 1 hour or a half an hour game with them, and they're excited and they want to keep going and they can focus, then of course continue. But introducing rules a little at a time, I think, is very important. Even with adults, we don't like, as a dungeon master, I don't want to hand the player's handbook to someone who's like, ooh, I watched Critical Role and I'd like to try this game out. I'm not going to hand them the player's handbook and go home and read this for 18 hours and then come back and you can play the game. I'm going to introduce them to the rules a little at a time, or in broad strokes, and then we'll work our way into the details. But the most important thing is, when introducing children to tabletop role-playing games, is to get them used to rolling the dice, referring to their character sheet, those kind of things. And I think this is the most critical advice that I can give to dungeon masters that are introducing tabletop role-playing games to children, is always end on a high note. You know, with grown-ups, we can kind of end a session in a lull, or we can end a session on a down note, those kind of things. But with children, I'm not saying that your game session has to end like a Saturday morning cartoon, but if you can get to a point in the session where at least it wraps up, and it wraps up on a high note, then they're more likely to want to sit back down and do it again. So that would be my advice.
Okay. So we end on a laugh like all the 70s shows, right?
Right. Or at least a cheer, at least, some kind of thrill, something that gets them excited, gets that blood pumping, and makes them go, man, I can't wait to play more.
Yeah. Well, as we're recording, my oldest is 6, and we haven't played yet, but I have talked to him and his younger brother a little bit, and I ask them like what kind of character they want to make, because they hear me talking about D&D all the time, since I play pretty much once a week, and of course now it's my job, so I talk about D&D all the time. So I'll ask him to make a character, and I know just recently my 6-year-old said his character's name is Zaktar, and he is an alien robot with ice and fire powers, and I was just like, well, that sounds great, right? Like, so what do you think about, like, kids just aren't like kind of constrained by anything when they start imagining? Is that a good thing?
Yes, that's a fantastic thing. A lot of times, experienced gamers like you and me, Matt, we've been doing it for so long, and we're so ingrained in the rules that immediately when someone, says that they're going to be an alien robot with ice powers, we start doing the math. Like, well, what level do you have to be, and what feats does he need, and what talent tree, whatever system you're using. And that's why I think that the games that are specifically designed for your children's age groups are so wonderful, because they don't put those kind of constraints. One of the worst things I think a dungeon master can do to a new player, regardless of age, is tell them, no, you can't play that. I think that the best thing for a dungeon master to do is to say, yes, but. So, depending on the system that you choose, you can have that freedom to make that kind of character. But I would almost always want the dungeon master to say yes, but, versus no, you can't play that. And one game that stands out to me, just like you described, is Amazing Tales. My children were beyond that system when it finally came out, when we were made aware of it. But one of the best things about it is the children can design any kind of character they want. So, alien robot with ice powers, boom, you are ready to go and ready to play. So, if you can't seem to get their imaginations to fit into as strict of a system as Dungeons and Dragons, there are alternatives.
Yeah, and I think that is really good advice, because I know of at least a few people over my decades of gaming that were turned off because the game master just kind of shut them down. You know, and maybe in one or two cases I did it, but you know,
we're all guilty of it. We're all guilty of it.
Yeah, just kind of shut them down and said, "Oh, you can't do that." And then just to realize, you know, a year or so later, it's just like, well, actually, they could have done that if I was, you know, if I would have just done this one little thing or something. You know, it's just like,
yes,
you know, and it's just like, well, we're all friends and we're all sitting around the table. What would it matter if somebody, you know, can shoot an icicle or something, you know, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you're absolutely right. And with experience, you learn. For me, a lot of times, I feel like setting is just window dressing. So if I had a player who said, I want to shoot icicles out of my hands, I would take the magic missile spell, and when it manifested, described it as icicles, and anything that's susceptible to cold takes damage from it. You know, those kind of things. Little tweaks like that can make it so you can turn that no into a yes, but.
Mm-hmm. No, I absolutely agree. And I think too, what you just said there about the setting as well is that, you know, you don't necessarily have to play a straight fantasy game or something like that. If that's not what, you know, the players are looking for, you can always just change up a little things here or there and make it, you know, kind of your own thing and suit people's, you know, kind of, if they want to play in a certain cartoon or a movie that they've seen. That's pretty easy to do, actually.
Yes. Again, it all goes back to the description of how things happen. You can use any rule set that you and your players are comfortable with. And I think exposure to multiple different kinds of games has helped me identify that.
Yeah. And that is, I don't know, it is sad. Sometimes we get locked into the box if we get so familiar with things. And I think sometimes it does take a child to kind of shake us out of it, because it's just like, why couldn't there be an alien robot, you know, in Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, there's everything else. Why couldn't there be one of those?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you know, you were saying maybe like one encounter or something like that. Like, maybe do you have an example of something you ran for your kids when they were a little bit younger that maybe I could run with my 6-year-old and 4-year-old or something like that?
Sure, absolutely. Now, I of course just I just took one of the greatest things about gaming with children is there are no tired cliche tropes. Okay. If I say to you, Matt, we're playing a game and we're going to guard the caravan and we've wandered into a goblin ambush. The kid in us says, yay, and a goblin ambush. But the adult in us says, another caravan escort, another goblin ambush. Let's hack through these goblins and get to the real encounter, right? Mm-hmm. But when you're introducing new players and children, especially, to their first tabletop role-playing games, a caravan escort around a wooded bend and with a hillside and a goblin ambush, depending on their age groups, it can be terrifying. Hero Kids RPG has an amazing module, and it's called Rats in the Basement. And basically, your adventurers are hired by the innkeeper to go down into his basement and clear out some regular rats and some dire rats. Okay. Mm-hmm. So for long-term gamers, we would be kind of ho-hummed about it. But when you run that for children, especially younger children like yours, I mean, they're scared. You know, they're worried about that dire rat. They're not really sure what that large rodent can do to them, and those kind of things. So that's what we mean by little encounters. Now, I ran again just custom things like the Caravan Escort. But Third Eye Games puts out this amazing RPG called Mermaid Adventures, where your children get to play merfolk, and their adventures are kind of single encounters. There was one that we played where there was a sunken pirate ship with treasure in it, and it had skeleton undead pirates that you had to fight as the merfolk, and those kind of things. So those little single encounter adventures are wonderful for younger players.
Okay. No, I can totally see that, and I was just thinking that gives me a chance to just reuse some material that I've that I've used already. Yeah, and I think that's a really good approach to take it just with kind of a simple encounter like that. And you are absolutely right that. When I'm trying to challenge my friends in my gaming group, I have to overcome, 30 years of them reading novels and seeing movies and things like this, where, where I can get found out if I'm trying to run a movie or run a book, something, some ideas out of that. But a 6-year-old is not going to know that one Star Trek: The Next Generation episode that I can just run.
Well, and that's what's wonderful, because even our best players sometimes become jaded, and they're like, okay, this is just like that one show where this happened and then that happened and then this happened, so let's just go do this. And you as the dungeon master are like, okay, I never seen that show, but that's exactly what's about to happen. What do I do? And but yes, your 6-year-old is not going to do that to you. They are going to be wide-eyed wonder, the whole thing. And what's so wonderful is, just like, one of the joys of parenting is everything you introduce children to, especially at those young ages, you get to rediscover it anew for the first time. Mm-hmm. I had a friend once say that he wished he could just empty his head of all the gaming experience over the decades and just again try to clear a cave of kobolds for the very first time. And when you dungeon master for children, you really get to. And the other thing that I would definitely recommend is, don't always, as dungeon masters, as adult gamers, don't forget the descriptive details. Matt, if I said to you, a group of gnolls come running down the tunnel at you in the cave, you already have a very good idea of what a gnoll is. They're running at you, so you may even not just envision hyena men, but you might envision the armor that they're wearing. You might know what kind of weapons they like to use. All of that is already in you. So I say gnolls are charging the party. You already got kind of an idea of what's going to happen. So when I dungeon master for children, and in particular, we had their first encounter with with gnolls. I had to literally describe these men with the heads of hyenas, and they were terrified. They were, what? They're hyena men, and they have swords, and they're wearing armor, and we're in a cave, and they're coming at us in the dark. I mean, it was an intense moment for them. And for me, it was just Noel's charging the party. And so I caution dungeon masters to not rush it. Don't skip it. Don't assume even the fourth or fifth time they run into that goblin ambush that they're going to be like, oh, just goblins. Because for children, the world's a big, scary place. And you say there's these little green guys with big ears and mouths full of teeth. I mean, that's frightening.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, it even goes beyond just running games for kids. I think those of us who've been around it for a long time can just forget to describe things. Just when we're running a game anyway, we forget some of the things that we know kind of build that experience just because we've done it so many times.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right.
Fall into some bad habits there, but yeah, and I can definitely see how that is something that you really want to keep in mind, that it's the child's first time encountering something like that. And because even as we're talking, I'm thinking back to one of the first times that I had played, and I think there was a room with giant spiders in it, right? And ever since then, of course, it's now a cliche, a room with giant spiders. But that first time was wild, because
yes.
I had just made a new character. I just had this character made or handed to me. I can't remember exactly what, and it was really cool. And now we're gonna fight these giant spiders. Oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? Kind of thing. And I guess it is. I think you did mention jaded, right? Because now I can do some of them, some of the calculations in my head, right? Okay, giant spiders. Okay, I'm level 3. I'm going to wipe these out really quick, and we'll get these dispatched, and we'll have to search the room, try to find the actual clue and stuff. These, and instead of really engaging with what's happening at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah. And that does bring up kind of an extra point that somebody, that I'm sure some people could be concerned about. What about violence when you're gaming with kids?
Yeah, so violence in tabletop role-playing games. Of course, we're talking about adventure games. So violence is a theme, but it doesn't have to be. There are lots of different genres of role-playing games, but also I think it all comes down to description. Okay. You can Saturday morning cartoon a tabletop role-playing game for kids. There's no need to go into the detail that the sword slashes open his torso, disemboweling the orc chieftain as his guts spill onto the floor in a splash and the life leaves he curses you to Grom, his dark orc god. You don't have to say that to your 6-year-old. You can say you hit him with the sword and he falls down and he doesn't get back up. Those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So you can handle it. And this is what I recommend to anyone who's going to be running tabletop role-playing games for children when it comes to violence. Think about the type of violence that they are accustomed to when it comes to their television shows, their video games, and the movies they watch. Okay, so at 4, 5, 6 years old, we're watching things like Dora the Explorer. We're watching Blue's Clues. We're watching. I might be aging myself with these shows. Matt, what kind of shows are your children watching now?
We don't let them watch too much, but we are just starting to show them the original DuckTales, and then we're starting to show them
very good. Very good.
Some of what is it, Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Okay, great. Well, taking DuckTales as an example, because that's a perfect show to base on. In DuckTales, they run into things like mummies, and they have these situations where they're flying in airplanes that are crashing out of the sky, things like that. So there are some thrills and there are some dangerous situations. So if that's the level of violence that your children are accustomed to, then you should mold the gameplay and its description around those sorts of things. So in Dungeons and Dragons, Matt, I sit you down at the table and I detail describe the rotting mummy emerging from his sarcophagus. I might even play some sound effects on the laptop of scraping stone against stone as he emerges, right? And then a horrible moan as he reaches out for you with a wrapped but clawed hand. Well, Matt, you're an experienced dungeon master. You know that you're going to need some kind of silver dagger or silver shine sword to handle this mummy. You don't want him to touch you. You're going to get mummy rot. Okay, so you're doing all the calculations in your head. You're going to put down the sword you've been using for 10 sessions now. You're going to pull out that silver dagger you'd never use, and you're going to fight the mummy with it. With children at young ages that are consuming media like DuckTales, they're going to think of out of the box ways of handling the antagonist. They're going to say, we're going to grab a hold of his wrappings and pull on them and spin him around and unwrap him, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're playing in a game that's very strict on its rules, like Dungeons and Dragons, we're going to have a hard time allowing that solution to defeat the mummy. But if you are running the game for your children and they've just watched the DuckTales episode with the mummy, and now you got a mummy adventure, and they try to handle it the way they did in the show, you as the dungeon master and the parent are going to want to try and somehow tailor that scenario to where you don't stifle those off the rail way of handling the situation. One of the other things is with violence is children often, not always as a rule, but younger children more often than not will try to find a non-violent resolution. I remember when they were younger, we had a scenario with a lich, and they wanted my oldest, the lich, a strong talking to about moral correctness and the difference between good and evil, in hopes that he would see the error of his ways and turn from being bad. And so, as the dungeon master, you're sitting there and you're going, what do you want to do on your turn? And they say, well, I'm going to explain to him why being evil is bad. And as a parent, you want to reward that. Yeah. You don't want to say, well, he's a lich, he doesn't care, and now you're 2 levels lower than you were. Yeah.
He's hitting you, or he's casting a spell on you or something.
Right. And that's okay to let them know that, as they get older, we're talking about, Matt, how old were you when you discovered tabletop role-playing games?
Gosh, I was 9 when I played D&D the first time.
Okay, so in that 9 to 12 age group, that early middle school, junior high age group, that's when we were discovering tabletop role-playing games and getting these massive books or these box sets and trying to figure them out most of the time with our friends. So as a parent, if you are coming back to the hobby and your children are, 10, 11, 12 years old, they're kind of already to that point playing Fortnite, and they're playing Payday, and they're watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. Their level of violence is a more mature level, so they can handle the stabbing the orc chieftain in the heart with a sword, and they can handle the arrows piercing the goblin raiders, that kind of thing. So what I always recommend is, as parents, if you haven't already, because as children get older, especially teens like mine, they have after school activities that they're going to. They have their friends online through the PlayStation or the Xbox. They're playing games on. This one's streaming, watching a movie in another room. It's and parents are busy. You're working, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So as life kind of pulls us apart in that way, you want to try and sit down just for a little while with them and watch a movie together, or watch them play a round of a game that they're playing. If they're playing War of Mordor, and you see that your child is Assassin Creeding orcs, right? And if that's his level of violence, then hey, guess what? We can take the gloves off. We can go full D&D on this, and those kind of things. So but actually observe not just the gameplay or the films or the media that they're consuming, but really observe how your child responds to that. When we play tabletop role-playing games, what a lot of people forget is it is not a passive activity. So in other words, when we're playing a video game, the controller's between us and the action. Okay. And if you've ever played a horror role-playing game like Resident Evil or something like that, you know that you can really feel the anxiety. You can really feel the fear. When you're watching a movie, it's even less, because movies and TV shows, it's happening to those characters, whatever the action is. You can still get frightened. You can still get jump scared, but it's not happening to you. When you play tabletop role-playing games, though, you are your character. So that insulation between the characters in a video game or a TV show and your tabletop role-playing is a lot thinner. And I bring this up to caution parents. If you're not familiar with the things that make your child frightened or uneasy or anxious when it comes to violence in media, or not even violence, even things that they're, intense action situations, those kind of things, you can actually turn your children off to tabletop role-playing games, because if you're not cognitive of that. And I'll give you an example. My youngest has a very strong phobia of any creepy crawlies, like any bugs, and he's been working on it for years, and we've been helping him. But there was a time when non-biting insects, ladybugs, butterflies, when he was much younger, terrified him. So I ran a 2-year campaign for them a few years back now, and really kind of introduced them to all the D&D monsters and cliche tropes, right? And one of the monsters that we had was the Umber Hulk. I had this wonderful miniature. They were exploring a cave. It comes crawling out of a hole, and the heroes are there with it. The massive Umber Hulk, and he's using his eyes on them, his eye gaze, all this stuff. My youngest was playing the half-orc barbarian tank of the party, and he told us, my character turns and runs. And at first we tried to talk to him. We were like, no. It's you're the big hulking half-orc barbarian. You're not afraid of this thing. But it was too close to his phobia, and his character, the differentiating between himself and his character was too thin. So he was gone for most of the scenario, and the group had to carry on and fight this Umber Hulk without him. So thankfully, that wasn't his first encounter in a role-playing game. That wasn't his first experience at tabletop role-playing games. Thankfully, his siblings, his cousin, and his mom were all playing with him, and they were understanding, and they didn't make fun of him and things like that. And so when we got past the Umber Hulk, he came back and he continued to play. But I could see how, if that had been his very first taste of tabletop role-playing games, how that would have left a negative effect on him, and he might not have played again until he met a group of friends years later.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you had a lot of great advice there, and I think it's all important to keep in mind. You had actually, while you were talking about that, it kind of reminded me a number of years ago, I ran a session for a few of my nephews who were like 11 and 9, and I ran a Star Wars session because they know the whole world, right? They know everything about Star Wars. And so, and I did remember back to like when I was 9 and 10 and playing, just like you had said, that they started looking for nonviolent resolutions to some of the problems. They were trying to trick the stormtroopers into rooms where they could lock them into the rooms, and kind of, in a few different things like that. And then also one thing that I had remembered, when I'd kind of forgotten about when I was little as well, is they do tend to run away a lot.
Yes.
You confront them with something and that you say, all right, there's this huge bounty hunter, he's standing right in front of you, and what do? And they're like, we just run away. And you're like, well, that's probably what a kid would do, right?
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. And one of the things that I even have to do this with adults, because even though I don't get to run games regularly, and I haven't been able to run a campaign for adults in a long, long time, I do run what people would consider like a convention session, like a 4-hour one shot. And I run those about once a quarter, so about 3 or 4 times a year. And I always try to introduce new players to the hobby. So at each table, there'll be 1 or 2 first-time gamers. But one of the things that I do with adults and children is kind of give them something that they can equate it to, as far as their character's power and level. Like, again, Matt, we've been gaming almost all our lives. So you tell me I'm a 5th level fighter, I kind of got an idea of what I can handle, what I can't, and what I need to run away from. But for new players, they don't have a point of reference. So I was running a game for some new players and some experienced players, and we were playing 8th level characters. So I explained to them, I said, look, you guys are like the Avengers of this setting. Okay. You are national heroes with all these super abilities. And because the group of adults were more familiar with superhero genre, I just used some of that language to help them understand just how powerful they were, and that it would need to be. It would have to be something that I said, if the Avengers won't run away from it, then you shouldn't run away from it either. And those kind of things. And that helped them kind of go, oh, well, we must be really amazing then. So I give them that little prelude build up, and they seem to tackle tasks a little more directly after that.
No, that's great advice. Yeah, because if you don't have a frame of reference, how are you going to know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how are you going to know if you should open hand slap the ancient black dragon across the face or not? Right?
Right.
If you're level 2, you shouldn't do that. Right? Yeah. Well, Nick, thank you so much for all of your advice and telling us all of these things. Where can people listen to your podcast?
Well, what's great about Raised on D&D is you can actually listen to it on all your podcast listening apps. And is very popular, of course, on Apple Podcast and Google Podcast. But now we're available on Spotify and on Amazon Music. So you can listen to us from all those spots. But if you don't like to listen remotely from apps, all you have to do is go to anchor.fm/raised on D&D, and you can listen to it right from your computer. But if you really want to be up to date on what's going on, a lot of times we have giveaways, and different guests of mine will have deals and sales and specials and things like that. So if you really want to follow Raised on D&D, the place where all the information is distributed is at the Facebook Raised on D&D page. So definitely check all those options out.
Okay. And for anyone who is listening, I will be sure to put links to the podcast and to the Facebook page in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So Nick, just thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you again, Matt. It was a pleasure, and I hope you'll come on my show next.
Oh, well, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nick. Gaming with your kids can be a very rewarding experience, and Nick has some great ideas of how we can do that better and better. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. As I mentioned, I have provided a link in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com to Nick's podcast, Raised on D&D. He has some amazing interviews with some incredible tips. You need to check it out. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what I am up to here at Dice Geeks. Now, hey guys, if you really enjoy this show, please consider supporting it in some way. You can like, subscribe, rate, or review the podcast wherever you are listening right now. Those reviews and ratings help the show out immensely, and I am grateful if you would do any of those things. Also, if you really want me to continue making this show, you can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show financially there. I am humbled that people take time out of their week to listen to my show, so I thank you so much for listening today, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming.